It was supposed to be the happiest weekend of their lives. The rehearsal dinner had gone off without a hitch, speeches, laughter, and a room full of smiles. But behind the facade, there was tension. You could feel it in the air, though no one dared to speak of it. Take David, the groom. Handsome, successful, and utterly charming. He had a way of lighting up a room, but tonight, something was off. His fiancée, Emma, didn't seem to notice, or maybe she just didn't want to. And then there was her father, Richard, a man so composed, so perfectly polished, you'd never think he had anything to hide. But secrets have a way of bubbling to the surface, no matter how deeply they're buried. The call came in at 2:47 a.m. A scream had echoed through the Miller estate, piercing the quiet of the countryside. By the time anyone reached the scene, David was lying in a pool of blood. To truly understand this story, we have to go back to the past, back before everything became complicated. Long before David entered Emma's life, and even before they were engaged, Richard and David shared a past, one that would forever shape their future. It began when David was just a 20-year-old student at an academy, a school where Richard Miller, a well-respected professor, taught. Richard was in his early 40s, sophisticated, confident, and charismatic. David, eager and impressionable, admired him for his sharp intellect and unapproachable aura. Their connection started innocently enough, as most student-teacher relationships do. They found themselves discussing philosophy and literature after class. The more they spoke, the deeper their bond grew. Richard, who prided himself on maintaining a professional distance, found himself drawn to David's eagerness and ambition. One evening, after a late lecture, David stayed behind in the classroom to talk. As they conversed, Richard's initial hesitation began to slip away. The conversation moved to more personal topics, and David, ever the attentive student, hung on every word. It was then that Richard made a fateful decision. As the night grew darker, their lingering proximity became charged. The line between professional and personal blurred in a way neither could ignore. One thing led to another, and before either could fully comprehend the consequences, they found themselves entwined in a forbidden relationship. Richard was a married man, but the affair persisted for months. It was their secret, one they kept hidden from the world. But, as all secrets do, it eventually became too difficult to maintain. When Richard's wife grew suspicious, he chose to end things. He broke off all contact with David, leaving him confused, angry, and deeply hurt. David tried to move on. Years passed, and he buried the memories deep. He focused on his career and met new people. It was during this phase that he found love, Emma. David first met Emma on a bright, sunny afternoon at a coffee shop in the heart of the city. He had been sitting by the window, nursing a cup of coffee, his eyes lost in a book, when she walked in. She seemed like just another person on her way to start her day, but something about her stood out. Maybe it was the way she smiled at the barista. David noticed that, even without trying, she commanded attention. She didn't notice him at first, but as she waited for her coffee, David couldn't help but watch her. She was dressed casually in jeans and a loose sweater, yet there was something graceful about her movements, something that made her stand out from everyone else. Emma finally turned, coffee in hand, and their eyes met. David felt a spark. Not a big one, but enough to make him look away quickly, embarrassed by his own thoughts. It was Emma who made the first move. She smiled shyly and asked if the seat across from him was taken. David quickly shook his head, his heart racing a little. He had been in coffee shops before, but this felt different. As she sat down, they exchanged a few polite words. She apologized for interrupting, explaining that she didn't mean to disturb him. David quickly assured her it was no problem at all. She was just looking for a quiet spot to enjoy her coffee. There was something easy about the way she spoke that made David feel more comfortable than he had expected. As they talked, they realized how many interests they had in common. They laughed at little jokes, exchanged thoughts on their favorite genres, and discovered shared experiences. David quickly forgot about the time, lost in the conversation, and feeling a connection that seemed so natural. When they finally parted ways, both felt a sense of lightness, something that had been missing from their lives for a while. Over the next few weeks, they met up more often, always for coffee, sometimes for lunch. Their bond grew stronger with each conversation, and David found himself eagerly looking forward to their next meeting. He had known for a while that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with Emma. It wasn't a decision he made on a whim. The more time they spent together, the more he realized how right they felt for each other. Emma had a way of making everything feel simpler, brighter. Her laughter was contagious, and her kindness made him want to be a better person. She understood him in a way no one else ever had, and he felt a connection with her like none he'd experienced before. After a few months of dating, David proposed to Emma near a park close to her apartment, where they often spent their evenings together. The proposal was simple, but filled with meaning. It wasn't extravagant, but it was real, honest, and perfect for them. A few days later, Emma invited David over to meet her family. She had talked about her parents before, but this was the first time David would meet them in person. He was nervous. Meeting a significant other's family always felt like a big step, and David had always been a little shy around new people. But Emma reassured him that her parents were easygoing and friendly, so there was no need to worry. When David arrived at the Miller household for the first time as Emma's fiance, he felt a mix of excitement and nerves. This was a major step in his life, and he wanted to make a good impression on her family. He never anticipated what would come next. Richard opened the door to greet him. The moment their eyes met, David's face shifted from smiling to confused. David felt his pulse quicken. Something wasn't right. His mind raced back to a time he thought he'd buried forever. Those late nights, the whispered words in the dark, the dangerous, forbidden relationship. He had told himself he was over it, that he had moved on. But standing before Richard again brought those emotions rushing back, raw and unrelenting. Richard's smile faltered for just a brief second, and David noticed it immediately. The calm, confident demeanor Richard usually carried seemed to crack, almost imperceptibly. But it was enough. There was a flash of recognition in Richard's eyes, a flicker of discomfort, of something David couldn't quite place but knew all too well. David tried to stay calm, though his thoughts were spiraling. He had convinced himself that those days were behind him, that the memories were locked away. But here he was, face to face with Richard, and suddenly it felt like no time had passed. Richard, despite the momentary hesitation, regained his composure quickly. His smile returned, but there was a tightness to it, as though it were forced. David noticed how Richard's gaze lingered on him just a little too long, as if he were searching for confirmation. Yet when Richard spoke, his voice carried no hint of familiarity. "Hi, you must be David," Richard said, extending his hand. David shook it, his grip firm but his mind anything but steady. He tried to act normal, to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His rational mind argued that Richard couldn't have known. It wasn't possible. Their paths had never crossed publicly, and they had never acknowledged the past. But deep down, David felt the truth stirring. Richard knew. The evening continued, but David's thoughts were elsewhere. Every glance Richard threw his way felt charged with unspoken tension. David tried to focus on Emma, her warmth and laughter, but the past loomed like a shadow, refusing to dissipate. After dinner, the unease deepened. Richard abruptly excused himself, his expression unreadable as he left the room. Emma seemed slightly unsettled, though she didn't say anything. Minutes later, as David stood by the window staring into the night, hurried footsteps broke the silence. Before he could react, Richard appeared in the doorway, his face clouded with anger. Gone was the cordial host. All that remained was a hard, steely glare. "What are you doing here?" Richard demanded, his voice low but razor-sharp, cutting through the air with hostility that made David's chest tighten. The words hung heavy, their weight suffocating. David felt frozen, unsure of how to respond. The warmth he had tried to carry into this situation now felt painfully hollow. Was this the welcome he had anticipated? No, but he had at least hoped for something more civil. He forced himself to speak, his voice softer than he intended. "I'm here for Emma," he said, keeping his tone steady, though his nerves were anything but. Richard's glare hardened, his expression darkening further. The silence stretched uncomfortably before Richard spoke again, his next words landing like a blow. "You're not just here to see Emma. You're here as her fiance?" The words seemed to burn in Richard's mouth as he spat it out. "You really think you can come into my home after everything?" David took a cautious step back, a cold shiver running down his spine. His mind reeled, scrambling to piece together what was happening. His confusion was genuine, but the look in Richard's eyes told him the ground had shifted beneath him, and he hadn't even noticed. He hadn't realized just how deeply he had buried the past until Richard's words dragged it all back. Those late-night encounters, the forbidden relationship that had left them both scarred, the whispered promises, the guilt, the ache. David had convinced himself he was over it, that it was a closed chapter, locked away forever. Yet now, standing here before Richard, it felt as though time had rewound, as if the years in between had never existed. David's thoughts scrambled for clarity. The tension wasn't just thick, it was suffocating. It wasn't only about their shared past, it was the revelation that Richard knew. Richard remembered. Their secret, once held in silence, now hung in the air, raw and unspoken. David had no idea how to handle it. He had thought he had moved on, thought he was in control of his life, his future with Emma. But here, with Richard's gaze heavy and accusing, everything felt like a fragile illusion. Before David could find the words to respond, Richard turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the hallway, trapped in a storm of emotions. David's chest tightened as he inhaled deeply, struggling to steady himself. He didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was certain: nothing was as simple as it seemed. Despite the tension, anger, and flood of memories Richard had stirred, David's resolve to marry Emma remained steadfast. He had envisioned this day for months, maybe even years. This was supposed to be the start of a new chapter, a life with Emma, free from the shadows of the past. He told himself the past couldn't hold him back. Nothing would stand in the way of the future he had imagined with her. The wedding day dawned unexpectedly warm, sunlight streaming through the church windows and casting golden hues across the polished wooden floors. Emma, radiant in her wedding dress, was breathtaking. Her smile, her glowing happiness, felt like everything David had ever wanted. Standing at the altar, his heart pounded as he watched her walk toward him, her arm looped through her father's. This was it, the moment he had dreamed of. Despite everything with Richard, the history they shared and the lingering unease, David focused on Emma. He couldn't let anything cloud this moment. As Emma approached, their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment all of David's doubts seemed to dissolve. Her genuine smile reassured him that they were meant to be. She was his future, and nothing, not the ghosts of the past nor Richard's anger, could take this away from him, or so he thought. But as the ceremony unfolded, as they exchanged vows and promised each other a lifetime of love, David couldn't shake the gnawing sensation that something was wrong. It wasn't Emma. She was perfect. It wasn't the wedding itself. It was Richard. The image of Richard's hard stare, the fury in his voice, and the memories they shared lingered at the edge of David's mind like an ominous shadow. David tried to push it all away. He had worked tirelessly to move past his history with Richard. He needed to, for his own peace of mind. And now, standing at the altar with Emma, he was determined to embrace a fresh start and leave the past where it belonged. But Richard's presence, even as he stood silently off to the side, cast a long shadow over David's thoughts. Richard had been uncharacteristically quiet during the ceremony, his silence more unsettling than any confrontation. When David had first entered the church, Richard offered only the briefest of nods, his expression unreadable. The air between them was charged with an unspoken tension, a subtle but unmistakable wariness. Emma noticed it too, the strained interactions between her father and her husband, but she couldn't make sense of it. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, David turned to face Emma, his heart swelling with love. Their kiss was tender and filled with promise, a moment that felt like the culmination of everything he had ever wanted. For a brief instant, the rest of the world faded away. leaving only Emma and the new life they were about to begin. But even in that perfect moment, he could feel Richard's eyes on him. The weight of Richard's gaze didn't escape him. It was a reminder that Richard hadn't let go of the past, and as much as David wanted to deny it, neither had he. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. The reception was lively, filled with laughter, music, and heartfelt toasts. David and Emma danced under the twinkling lights, surrounded by their friends and family. Yet in the back of his mind, Richard lingered. His words, his presence, his accusations, all of it haunted David. Even as he raised his glass to toast their future, the unease refused to leave. Emma was everything David had hoped for. She was his anchor, his light in the dark, the person who had helped him heal from wounds he didn't even realize he carried. But with Richard watching them from the sidelines, David couldn't help but wonder if the past could ever truly stay buried. As the night wore on, the celebration began to wind down. Guests said their goodbyes, offering final congratulations and well wishes to the happy couple. Emma, still radiant with joy, clung to David's arm as they waved goodbye to their family and friends. But amid the warm farewells, Richard remained in the background, his expression unreadable. David knew he couldn't avoid Richard forever. The weight of their unresolved history was too heavy. When Emma excused herself to chat with one of her friends, David felt a familiar presence behind him. Turning, he found Richard standing a few feet away, arms crossed and eyes locked on him with a piercing intensity. For a moment, the noise of the reception seemed to fade. The two men stood in a silent standoff, the tension thick enough to cut. David's chest tightened under Richard's gaze, a flood of emotions rising. Guilt, anger, and the unease of secrets long buried but never forgotten. He had spent years convincing himself he had moved on from the man who had once meant everything to him. But tonight, with Richard standing there, all those carefully constructed walls threatened to crumble. Before David could speak, Richard turned on his heel and disappeared into the thinning crowd. David exhaled sharply. This wasn't the time for ghosts of the past. Tonight wasn't about Richard or what they had shared. It was about Emma, the woman who had given him hope for a future. But no matter how hard he tried, the shadow of the past lingered, a quiet reminder that some things are not so easily left behind. Later that evening, David and Emma returned to the quaint countryside inn where they were spending their first night as husband and wife. The room was adorned with delicate flowers, soft candlelight casting a warm glow over the space. Emma was radiant, laughing as she recounted her favorite moments from the day, but David's thoughts were elsewhere. Lying next to Emma that night, David stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He had believed that marrying Emma would offer him a clean slate, a chance to leave everything behind. But seeing Richard again, feeling the weight of his anger and their shared history, had thrown David off balance. He couldn't let this fester. Whatever lingering emotions existed between him and Richard had to be addressed, for Emma's sake and his own. Careful not to wake her, David slipped out of bed and stepped outside. The crisp night air offered little comfort to his restless mind. He told himself he needed just a moment to clear his head, but deep down, he knew there was more to it than that. Almost without realizing it, David found himself heading toward the Miller estate, his feet moving as if guided by an unseen force. When Richard saw David approach, his face hardened, but he remained still. David's steps were hesitant yet deliberate, and the tension between them snapped like a taut wire the moment he stopped in front of Richard. Heated words followed, bitter, sharp accusations filled with blame, regret, and years of unresolved pain. David accused Richard of abandoning their past, of pretending it had never existed. Richard fired back, his voice thick with anger and anguish, accusing David of betrayal and selfishness. He spoke of his loneliness after his wife's passing, of how deeply he had felt David's absence. In the chaos of emotions, the distance between them seemed to vanish. Old wounds were ripped open, exposing raw, unhealed scars. For a fleeting moment, neither man could resist the pull of what they once had. It wasn't love, it was something darker and more desperate, born of longing and unresolved pain. But reality came crashing back just as quickly. David pulled away, his heart pounding as the enormity of what had just happened hit him. This wasn't closure, it wasn't healing. It was a mistake, dangerous and irreversible. He had come here to make things right, but everything had only unraveled further. David's expression darkened, his voice trembling with anger as he declared that this had to end. He wouldn't let the past ruin his future, and he wouldn't let Richard destroy his life with Emma. Richard tried to reason with him, but David's fury only grew. His movements became sharper, more deliberate as he stepped closer. The air shifted, charged with something unspoken, yet unmistakably dangerous. In the struggle that followed, the fight spiraled out of control. The push and pull of their conflict blurred into chaos, and then, suddenly, there was silence. David lay motionless on the ground, his face pale and still, his chest no longer rising with breath. Richard's hands trembled as he stared down at what he had done. The night that had begun with tension ended in tragedy. Richard stood frozen over David's lifeless body, his mind reeling with the realization that there was no undoing this, no way to turn back the clock. David was gone, and with him the last remnants of their shared past. The oppressive silence was broken by the sound of footsteps. Richard turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat. Emma stood in the doorway, her face pale with confusion. She had woken earlier to find David gone and had come searching for him. Her wide eyes darted between Richard and David's lifeless form, her expression shifting from confusion to horror as the scene before her sank in. Emma had wrapped a shawl over her shoulders to shield herself from the night's chill, but the warmth of the fabric did nothing to soften the cold disbelief in her eyes. They were wide, brimming with an emotion Richard couldn't yet place: shock, disbelief, or the dawning recognition of something unspeakable. Her gaze shifted from her father to the unmoving figure of her husband sprawled on the ground. Her voice broke the suffocating stillness, trembling and uncertain. What happened? The question came as a threadbare whisper, barely audible over the pounding in Richard's ears. Richard's mind scrambled for an explanation, but the words refused to form. He could see the pieces falling into place in Emma's mind. The scene before her, the anguish etched on his face, and David's lifeless body. It painted a picture she wasn't ready to see, one she couldn't yet comprehend but knew was all too real. Richard took a tentative step toward her, his hands raised in a desperate gesture of reassurance. Emma flinched, recoiling as if his touch might burn her. Her eyes darted back to David's motionless form, searching for any sign of life, hoping against hope that this was some horrific misunderstanding. But David didn't move. The weight of finality pressed down on her, suffocating and inescapable. Her knees buckled and she gripped the doorframe for support. Her breath came in shallow, rapid gasps as panic overtook her. Richard opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to beg for her understanding, but no words could bridge the chasm between them. The truth was a labyrinth of betrayal and secrets, one that could never bring David back. Emma's face twisted, a maelstrom of anguish and fury contorting her features. She stared at Richard, the father she had trusted, the man who had been her anchor, and saw someone she no longer recognized. His hands, trembling and stained by the night's events, told a story of loss and violence. The man she had chosen to spend her life with was gone, and her father stood at the center of it all. Richard sank to his knees beside David, his hands clutching his hair as a guttural cry tore from his throat. The weight of what he had done, of what could never be undone, crushed him. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, illuminating the scene in pale, unforgiving hues, Richard realized that everything he had known, his relationship with Emma, the fragile threads of his past, and the life he had desperately clung to, was irrevocably shattered.